The bandits were almost completely wiped out in Saratov province with the help of the peasants who hated them. During the summer of 1921, Uborovich's units, with considerable cooperation from the population, eliminated the bands of Vaska Karas and Boguslavsky near Novokopersk. There were many fierce engagements with the Antonovites. One that took place in the spring of 1921 near the village of Vyazovaya Pochta, not far from the Zherdeva railway station, has stuck in my memory. Early in the morning, our regiment, which was part of a brigade, was alerted. Scouts had reported a concentration of up to 3,000 of Antonov's horsemen some 10 to 15 kilometers from the village. Our 1st Cavalry Regiment proceeded from Vyazovaya Pochta in the left column, while the 2nd Regiment advanced 4 or 5 kilometers to the right. My squadron, equipped with 4 machine guns and 1 artillery piece, was ordered to move along the highway in the van. We had covered about 5 kilometers when the squadron encountered an Antonov detachment of about 250 sabres. We deployed quickly, turned the gun around, and despite the enemy's numerical superiority, launched an attack. Our swift blow broke the Antonovites, and they retreated with considerable losses. In a hand-to-hand fight, an Antonovite fired his sawed-off rifle at me and killed my horse. We fell, the horse pinning me down, and the next moment I would have been slashed to death but for Nochevka, the political instructor, who came to my rescue. With a swing of his sabre, he killed the bandit, caught the reins of his horse, and helped me into the saddle. Soon we noticed a column of enemy cavalry trying to outflank us. We immediately concentrated our fire on this column and sent a messenger to report the situation to the regimental commander. In 20 or 30 minutes, our regiment drew up and engaged the enemy. The 2nd Regiment had run into superior enemy forces and had to retreat. Taking advantage of the situation, an enemy unit attacked our flank. The regimental commander decided to withdraw to Vyazovaya Pochta, luring the enemy into unfavourable terrain. My squadron was to cover the regiment during the disengagement. Detecting the manoeuvre, the enemy charged my squadron, which then acted as the rearguard for the regiment. The engagement was extremely fierce. The bandits were aware that we were greatly outnumbered and felt certain they would crush us, but that was easier said than done. What saved us was that the squadron had 4 machine guns with plenty of ammunition and a 76mm field gun. By moving these weapons from place to place, we fired at the attackers almost point blank. Moving slowly backward, we saw the battlefield become covered with dead enemy soldiers and horses, but we too were suffering heavy losses. I saw my good friend, platoon commander Ukach Ogorovich, fall out of the saddle, badly wounded. He was a competent commander and well brought up. His father, a colonel in the old Russian army who sided with the Soviets from the very first, was a leading instructor at our Ryazan commander's courses. Before he lost consciousness, Ukach Ogorovich whispered, "Write my mother, don't leave me to the bandits." We put our wounded beside the dead on the gun carriage and machine gun sleds and took them with us so the bandits would not mutilate them. The counter-attack planned by the regiment did not materialize. The thin ice on the river we were to cross gave way, and we had to continue our retreat as far as Vyazova Pochta. We were already in the village when I rushed to a group of bandits who were trying to get our machine gun. For the 2nd time that day, the horse under me was killed. Revolver in hand, I fought the bandits who were trying to capture me alive. Political instructor Nochevka again came to my rescue, assisted by soldiers Brixin, Gorshkov and Kovalev. Casualties in my squadron that day were 10 men killed and 15 wounded. 3 of the wounded died the next day. Kach Igorovich, my friend and mate, was one of them. That had been a hard day for us. We grieved over the loss of our comrades. The only thing that took the edge off our pain was the knowledge that we had eliminated such a large bandit force. For this, most of the commanders and political officers, and many of the soldiers, were decorated. I was among them. Here is what is said in the order of the top command of August 31st, 1921. Decorated with the Order of the Red Banner is the commander of the 2nd Squadron, 1st Cavalry Regiment, Detached Cavalry Brigade, for having held off an onslaught of the enemy numbering from 1,500 to 2,000 sabres for 7 hours, with his squadron in a battle at the village of Vyazovaya Pochta, Tambov Province, on March 5, 1921, and then, counterattacking, smashed the bandits after 6 hand-to-hand clashes. The end of summer 1921 saw the final mopping up of the small bands scattered about Tambov province. They had to be wiped out completely as soon as possible. My squadron was tasked with eliminating Zverev's band of about 150 men. The band was soon detected, and we took off in pursuit. Gradually, the band was losing strength. Near the edge of a forest, we managed to catch up with it and attacked. The fighting was over within an hour, but in the gathering dusk, Zverev and 4 of his men escaped into the forest. Nothing could help them, however. The Antonov bands in Tambov province existed no longer. I recall a curious incident that occurred on that occasion. As we pursued the band, we suddenly came upon 2 armoured cars that came rolling from a nearby village. Since we knew the band had no armoured cars, we did not fire on them. The armoured cars, however, took up an advantageous position and trained their machine guns on us. Why on earth? We sent messengers. It turned out they were our armoured cars, with Uborovich himself in the leading one. On learning of the band's retreat in the direction of the forest, he had decided to intercept it. Good thing we cleared up matters, or the consequences might have been disastrous. That is how I first met Uborovich. We saw much of each other later, between 1932 and 1937. He was then in command of the Byelorussian military district, where I was a cavalry division commander. Years passed. The hardships of the Civil War were forgotten. But we will never forget that each of us was motivated by the firm belief in the justice of the ideas proclaimed by Lenin's party in October 1917. British General Knox wrote to his government at that time that it was possible to crush a 1 million-strong Bolshevik army, but when 150 million Russians did not want the whites and wanted the reds, it was futile to help the former. For a number of reasons, the Red Army could not make full use of the experience gained in previous wars, including World War I. To fight the enemies of the young Soviet state, we had to create a clearly class-motivated military organization and arm it with new views on the essence and methods of struggle. No revolution is worth anything unless it can defend itself, said Lenin. It was the party, its central committee, and Lenin himself who, in the years of the Civil War, played a decisive role in organizing the country's defense, uniting efforts at the front and in the rear, and raising the masses of workers, peasants, and Red Army men to fight the interventionists and the counter-revolution. Hundreds and thousands of measures were taken that secured victory over the enemy. Historians have ascertained that between December 1, 1918 and February 27, 1920, the Council of Workers' and Peasants' Defence held 101 meetings at which 2,300 questions were discussed concerning the organisation of the country's defence, the supply of the Red Army and Navy with material, armaments, other equipment and victuals. All the meetings but 2 were presided over by Lenin. Documents dating back to the Civil War show that directives and decisions of the party's Central Committee and its political bureau, as well as Lenin's instructions, formed the basis of the concrete plans of military operations worked out by the Red Army High Command and the revolutionary military councils of the various fronts. The strategic plans of all major campaigns were thoroughly discussed at plenary and routine meetings of the party Central Committee. Lenin had close contacts with the High Command, the fronts and armies, and intimately knew many commanders and political workers. He constantly corresponded with them. Lenin signed at least 600 letters and telegrams on matters concerned with the defense of the Soviet state during the Civil War. At the same time, neither Lenin nor the Party Central Committee duplicated the functions of the High Command or the Revolutionary Military Council of the Republic in operational control of the fronts and armies or of combat actions. On learning that some military leaders had doubts about the plan for fighting Denikin, that plan was worked out by Commander-in-Chief SS Kamenev. Lenin, on behalf of the Political Bureau, wrote to Trotsky, "The Politburo fully recognizes the operational authority of the Commander-in-Chief and asks you to make this clear to all top-level executives." When SS Kamenev asked Lenin to show all draft directives of the government on operational matters to the High Command, Lenin made the following note on the letter to that effect sent by SS Kamenev to all members of the party's political bureau. I think the request should be granted and a decision taken that either the Commander-in-Chief should be called in personally or the draft directives sent to him for his urgent opinion. By and large, the Revolutionary Military Council of the Republic and military councils of the fronts and armies did their work in compliance with decisions of the Communist Party's Central Committee. Central Committee instructions were followed in building up the Republic's defences and in appointing commanders and commissars to responsible posts. The decision of the CCRCP-B on the policy of the War Department, adopted late in 1918 on Lenin's initiative, pointed out that the party was responsible for the policy of the military department and extended its influence to all military matters and to combat operations of the Soviet armed forces. Communists, as the cementing force in the Red Army Communists, were the cementing force in the Red Army. The party's Central Committee had repeatedly carried out mobilizations of party members, sending them to key sectors of the front. In October 1918, there were 35,000 communists in the army. A year later, their number had already increased to about 120,000, and by August 1920, it rose to as high as 300,000, which was 50% of the party membership at that time. The acknowledged superiority of the Red Army in morale and political awareness, which proved to be a decisive factor in the Civil War, was due to the militant and patriotic activities of army communists, commissars, political departments, and party cells. Speaking of the role played by the army's party political apparatus, M.V. Frunze wrote, "Who was it that introduced elements of order and discipline in the ranks of our young red regiments formed to the thunder of gunshots? Who was it that, in the evil hours of failure and defeat, encouraged the men, bringing new energy into their shaken ranks? Who was it that organized the army's rear, establishing Soviet power and Soviet order there, creating conditions for the rapid and successful advance of our armies? Who was it that worked persistently and tenaciously to demoralize the enemy army and undermine its rear, thus paving the way for future successes? All this was done by the political bodies of the army, and I must say they managed brilliantly. The services they performed in the past are beyond all praise. I readily subscribe to this 1,000 times and certify to its truth. During the Civil War, the party and the people not only crushed the enemy, but also laid the foundation of a mass army recruited by general conscription of the working people. Central and local military administrations were established, the first regulations and manuals were developed, and a uniform structure for units and formations was introduced. By the end of 1920, our army numbered 5,500,000 men, though it had suffered tremendous losses from September 1918 to December 1920. 800,000 were killed, wounded, or missing, and nearly 1,400,000 died of serious diseases caused by malnutrition and lack of clothes, footwear, medicines, and medical services. The theoretical conclusions drawn from the vast military experience accumulated during the Civil War were used as guidelines for building up the Soviet armed forces for many years. I would like to say a few words about the following. 1. Unity of the army and the people. The Civil War forcefully demonstrated the unity of the front and the rear, particularly the military advantages of a country that had become a military camp. This unity was based on the Soviet social and state systems and the worker-peasant alliance, as well as the identity of purpose shared by the army and the people. As a result, a force emerged that significantly enhanced the effectiveness of their weapons. For the first time in world history, an army was created that knew what it was fighting for. The workers and peasants, making incredible sacrifices, realized that they were defending the Soviet Socialist Republic, the rule of the working people. This was identified by Lenin as the source of their strength. 2. Leading role of the party. The leading role of the Communist Party in addressing military problems and its influence on the army through the party political apparatus were of paramount importance. The party's position as the ruling party in a country with publicly owned means of production allowed for an unprecedented concentration of economic resources to solve major military problems. This created a unique opportunity for maneuvering vast material and manpower resources, following an integrated military policy and making military directives obligatory for all. Party political work directed all conscientious forces in the army and navy, loyal to the revolutionary cause, towards a common goal, which multiplied their efficiency and became a source of mass heroism. Lenin stated, "It was only because of the party's vigilance and its strict discipline, because the authority of the party united all government departments and institutions, because the slogans issued by the Central Committee were adopted by tens, hundreds, thousands, and finally millions of people as one man, and because incredible sacrifices were made, it was only because of all this that the miracle which occurred was made possible. It was only because of all this that we were able to win in spite of the campaigns of the imperialists of the Entente and of the whole world having been repeated twice, thrice, and even 4 times. 3. Centralization, one-man command, and iron discipline. The principle of strict centralization, one-man command, and iron discipline was especially critical, particularly since this principle had been attacked by various oppositionists. Lenin pointed out that the absence of one-man command in the army all too often leads to inevitable disaster, chaos, panic, division of authority, and defeat. Attempts to oppose guerrilla forms of army organization, which are permissible during the formation of an army, to the principles of building a regular army, that is, centralized and uniform control at all levels and strict subordination and discipline, were consistently combated in many basic documents of party congresses and Central Committee plenary meetings, as well as in daily party work. It goes without saying that one-man command was to be introduced in strict compliance with the concrete historical conditions, taking into account the class composition of the body of commanders, their political maturity and military training level, and the readiness of the masses to accept different forms of administration. It was natural, therefore, that during the first years of Soviet power, it was impossible to introduce one-man command. But gradually, Lenin's principle of one-man command became the standard and basic principle of command in the Soviet army, combining with the greater role played by army political bodies and party organizations. Coupled with strict discipline, based on the Red Army men's constant awareness and conscientious discharge of their duty to defend their homeland, one-man command became instrumental in strengthening the will of the troops and improving their knowledge and motivation. Each period in the history of our country introduced new features to the building of the Soviet armed forces, strengthening and preparing them to repulse aggression. The military experience acquired during the Civil War and the basic principles formulated at that time with Lenin's personal participation, notably those I have listed above, were elaborated upon in the 1930s and 1940s, helping to increase the might of the Soviet army, which routed fascism in the Great Patriotic War. When the Soviet people returned to a peaceful life after their heroic victory in the Civil War, they faced colossal difficulties in rebuilding the dislocated national economy. Almost all branches of the economy lay in ruins. Every effort had to be concentrated on rectifying the critical condition of industry, agriculture, and transport. It was necessary to send several million demobilized soldiers to assist with reconstruction work. The cost of maintaining the army had to be reduced. At the same time, it was imperative to maintain and strengthen the country's defenses. Lenin said, "We have already taught a number of powerful countries not to wage war on us, but we cannot guarantee that this will last long." By 1920 and 1921, troops not participating in military actions were either fully or partially assigned to help with the country's rehabilitation. A commission was established under the Labour and Defence Council, headed by Kalinin and Dzerzhinsky, to direct labour armies in augmenting fuel and raw materials supplies and to raise agricultural output. By the end of 1924, the strength of the armed forces was reduced from 5.5 million to 562,000. Demobilization was certainly in the interests of millions of soldiers who longed for their ploughs and machine tools and missed their families and homes. It was hard to keep the soldiers in the army, especially since most of them were peasants. This process could wash away the core of the army. In February 1921, demobilization of communists was halted by a decision of the Organizing Bureau of the Russian Communist Party's Central Committee. Sometime earlier, the party's Central Committee addressed all party organizations in a circular letter on the Red Army, warning against any slackening of concern for the Red Army. In general, however, most of the men who stayed in the ranks did so because, by virtue of their inclination and ability, they had chosen to devote themselves to military service. In the context of peaceful construction, it was imperative to work out a single military doctrine, consolidate the regular Red Army, settle new complex organizational questions, and organize the training of military and political cadres. Special attention was given to strengthening specialized technical units, such as machine gun, artillery, armor, and aviation, and providing them with necessary resources. These issues were thoroughly discussed at the 10th, 11th, and 12th Congresses of the party, where they were a subject of heated debate. On instructions from the Party Central Committee, M.V. Frunze and S.I. Gusev prepared the theses Reorganization of the Red Army, advocating a regular army while envisaging a gradual transition to militia formations and supporting the development of Soviet military science. Others favoured immediately introducing the militia principle in staffing the army. The 10th Congress of the party adopted the Leninist principle of military construction in times of peace, with a resolution explicitly stating, "The agitation of certain comrades for dissolving the present Red Army and going over at once to a militia is wrong and, in effect, dangerous at the moment." Despite all the party's efforts to strengthen the army, it was felt that more radical steps were needed, and the sooner the better. From June 1922 to March 1923, I served as squadron commander in the 38th Cavalry Regiment, then as second in command of the 40th Cavalry Regiment, 7th Samara Cavalry Division. These regiments had experienced commanders, and I learned much from them. The command personnel, party members, and political workers of the regiments formed a close-knit, efficient body. During this period, most of the Red Army units lacked well-appointed barracks, houses for commanders, mess rooms, clubs, and other essentials for the normal life of servicemen. We were scattered, living in villages, quartered in peasant houses. Food was prepared in field kitchens, and horses were kept in private yards. We accepted this as a matter of course, considering that our country was going through exceptional difficulties. The commanding officers were mostly young and robust individuals, full of energy and persistence. Additionally, most of us were single and had only our service to focus on. We worked tirelessly for 15 or 16 hours a day. Still, we were short of time to do everything we wanted to do. One day, in the spring of 1923, I was summoned to the divisional commander. I did not know why, and must admit I was a bit worried. Had I done something wrong? The commander, N.D. Kashirin, received me cordially, offered tea, and began asking about combat and tactical training in the regiment. Then he asked, "Do you think our cavalry is getting proper training for a future war, and what do you think a future war will be like?" The question looked tricky. I blushed and could not answer at once. The commander saw my confusion and waited patiently for me to gather my wits. "One thing is clear," I began. "We commanders lack the due knowledge and skills to train the troops for modern warfare. We still train our men the way we were trained in the Tsarist army. To give the men the proper training, we must first equip commanders with a modern approach to military science." "That's right," the commander agreed. "We are trying to put all our commanders through military political courses and academies, but it's a long process, and we don't have enough educational facilities yet. You will have to study by yourself for a while." He paced the room and suddenly announced that it had been decided to appoint me commander of the 39th Buzuluk Cavalry Regiment. "I don't know you very well, but the comrades I spoke to recommend you for the post. If you have no objections, go to headquarters and get your orders. The assignment has already been signed." I was thrilled. My new position was quite an honour and very responsible. To command a regiment was always considered a most important stage in mastering the military art. The regiment is the basic combat unit where the cooperation of all ground arms, and sometimes not only ground arms, is organised for combat. A regimental commander must know his own units well as the support units normally assigned to the regiment in combat. He must properly choose the main direction in battle and concentrate his main forces accordingly. This is particularly important when fighting a superior enemy force. A commander who has mastered the system of controlling a regiment and can keep it in constant combat readiness will always be an advanced military leader at all other levels of command, both in peacetime and in war. By the end of the Civil War, the Army had over 200 schools and courses training cadres for all arms of the service. In 1920, commander courses had trained 26,000 Red Army commanders. A broad network of courses, schools, and academies was being established. A single system of training and educating proletarian commanders and political workers was emerging. Junior commanders were initially trained at regimental schools for 7-10 months. Medium-rank commanders were educated at regular military and naval schools, while senior commanding officers attended military academies. National military schools were opened in Union republics. Later on, refresher courses for commanding personnel played an important role. I attended such courses, of which I will speak below. In my opinion, training and self-education in camp conditions were of no less importance for shaping skilled commanders, especially in the junior and middle echelons. Hundreds of thousands of servicemen added to their knowledge in this way, perfected their skills, and immediately tested them during exercises, manoeuvres, and marches. Those unable, for some reason, to join a military school engaged in self-education in their own units. Of course, after the successful completion of the Civil War, there were commanders who thought they had nothing more to learn. Some of them saw their error in time and changed their behaviour accordingly. Others, who preferred to remain with the old stock of knowledge, were soon unable to cope with the new demands and were forced to retire. In late May 1923, when I was put in command of the 39th Regiment, it was preparing to go to camp for cavalry training for the first time since the Civil War. Many commanders had no clear idea of how to go about their work in the new conditions. Upon assuming command, I found that combat readiness was inadequate. Firing and tactical training were particularly poor. I therefore ordered the units to concentrate on the organisation of facilities for camp training. In early June, the camp was essentially ready. The regiment was quartered in a well-arranged tent camp with a good summer mess hall and a club. Sheds and tethering posts were put up for the horses. We were particularly proud of our firing range for all types of arms. We started combat training and political education classes. We worked hard and were pleased that our efforts were yielding good results. Squadron commanders and political instructors worked in a spirit of friendly cooperation and displayed much initiative. The creative energy and initiative of the Communists was evident in all undertakings. I want to make special mention of A.M. Yanin, our commissar. He was a staunch communist and a fine man who was in rapport with the soldiers, never grudged them a kind word, and yet could be demanding. He was respected and loved by everybody. It is truly a pity that this outstanding commissar was killed in action in 1942 on the Caucasian front. His son, whom he had raised a staunch patriot, was killed in the same battle. In midsummer, G.D. Guy, a Civil War hero, took over command of the division. It gives me pleasure to recollect our cooperation. We first met in his tent in camp, where all commanders and commissars were summoned for a conference. After the official introduction, Guy invited everyone present to be seated round his desk. He was a handsome man with a military bearing and a kindly look. His quiet, even voice spoke of composure and confidence. I had heard much of his heroic deeds, and was looking at him with interest to see what sort of commander and man he was. Our talk was long, but when we took leave of him, everybody was favourably impressed by this first meeting. As we shook hands on parting, he said he would like to visit my regiment in a couple of days to see equestrian and tactical exercises. I was flattered, but admitted that we still had many shortcomings. "We'll put them right together," Guy said with a smile, and added, "It's good you want to make a good showing." 3 days later, on orders from Divisional HQ, the regiment was lined up for an inspection review. Guy, on a black horse with white stockings, mounted a hill to watch the exercises. The horse was restive, but the commander held him in check with an iron hand and strong legs. At first, the orders were given orally, then by waving the sabre, the so-called wordless exercise, and finally by trumpet calls. Maneuver patterns, movements, approaches, turns, halts, and alignments were executed more smartly than I had expected. Finally, the regiment was deployed into Cossack charge formation, and I directed the centre towards the hill where the divisional commander was watching us. I ordered the regiment to close up towards the centre and to even ranks. Then I galloped up to the divisional commander to report the end of the exercise. He interrupted me, threw up his hands, and shouted in mock despair, "I surrender!" Then, riding up to me, he said warmly, thank you very much." He rode along the lined-up regiment, drew near the centre, stood in his stirrups, and addressed the men. "I am an old cavalryman and well familiar with the combat training of the cavalry. Today you proved that you honestly do your duty to your country and do not spare yourselves. This is as it should be. Proper training and awareness of your duty to the people are a guarantee of the invincibility of our heroic Red Army. Thank you. You have made me happy." He turned to me, gripped my hand, and said with a smile, "We'll see the second part of the exercises some other time. Let the regiment rest, and you and I will go and see how the camp is organized." He walked about the camp for more than 2 hours, looking into every detail. Then he had a long talk with the men, telling them of his Civil War experiences. He took leave only when the bugler sounded the call for dinner. On seeing the commander off, Commissar Yanin and I discussed what we had to do to prevent excess complacency and self-assurance. The commander's commendation inspired the men, which was evidenced by the results. To us commanders, his friendly, unassuming manner of treating the men was a splendid example. Later, Guy often visited the regiment to talk with the commanders and men. He was not just a superior, he was a welcome friend, a true communist. We finished the camp exercises with good ratings. Towards the end of September, the 7th Samara Cavalry Division was dispatched to Orsha for district field games. Such games, like the camp training, were the first since the Civil War. They were small-scale games, held in passing, so to say, on the way back from the summer camps. Yet our division was assigned a rather difficult task. It was to make a forced march towards Orsha. The divisional commander ordered my regiment to be the advance guard, which meant that we would have to cover a great distance in a short time, provide security on the move, and be constantly ready to deploy and engage the enemy, thus furnishing the most favourable conditions for the division's main force to go into action. It took the division 30 hours to make the march. We covered 100 kilometres and made 2 5-hour halts on the way. It was a severe test of the horses' endurance. Besides, they had to be fed and watered during halts, and furthermore the men had to keep their accoutrements in order. Despite fatigue, all were in high spirits, for it had become known that after the games, the 7th Cavalry Division would be quartered in Minsk. At dawn, the scouts whom I had sent forward reported that an enemy force was heading for Orsha railway station on the other side of the Moscow-Orsha railway. Enemy formations had already engaged the units covering the approaches to the railway station. As is usual during field exercises, umpires with white armbands rushed to the regiment. Umpires are commanders who help the top command in conducting the games. They fired incessant questions. "What information do you have about the enemy? What is your decision?" I answered that I would immediately ride to the forward detachment for on-the-spot reconnaissance and would make my decision there. I spurred my horse and in a few minutes galloped up to the vanguard detachment under K. Tupin, an energetic squadron commander. He reported that something like 2 enemy infantry regiments were deployed in pre-battle formation on the other side of the railway tracks and were advancing in the general direction of the elevations lying ahead. A battle was in progress with our infantry. The enemy was apparently unaware that our units were approaching the battle area, for we had not seen either his security detachments or his reconnaissance. The commander of the vanguard detachment had barely finished his report when a knot of horsemen appeared in the distance, heading our way. We recognized Division Commander Guy by his white-stockinged horse. I briefly informed him of the situation and mentioned that it was an opportune moment for a surprise attack. I had decided to deploy the regiment for combat and attack the enemy flank as the terrain was favourable. The commander looked through his binoculars and said, "It's a rare chance, but make it snappy. Support the attack with artillery and machine gun fire. The division's main force will come up in 20 or 30 minutes. It will strike the enemy in the rear to complete the rout." An hour later, the battlefield was enveloped in smoke and dust. The cavalry regiments of the 7th Division were swooping down in battle formation on the enemy with a loud hurrah. It was a thrilling sight. Flushed faces, glaring eyes, just like a real battle. A bugle call interrupted the attack. The exercises were over. There was no post-exercise critique. We were told that M.N. Tukhachevsky had watched the battle and spoken highly of our units. He was particularly pleased with the 7th Cavalry Division for the forced march and the spirited attack. The enemy infantry won his praise for quickly deploying to meet the cavalry charge on its flank. We were pleased that Tukhachevsky had praised us and were glad that the enemy's good manoeuvrability had also been noted. We rested and a couple of days later marched to Minsk, where our division was to have permanent quarters. Thousands of townspeople lined the streets, cheering us all the way. I believe no other army in the world enjoys the sympathy and love of the people as much as our Soviet army. I am still moved when I remember how the veterans of our division, men who had fought in the battles of Tsaritsyn, Kislyak, Astrakhan, Pugachevsk and Buzuluk, met us. They had not spared themselves fighting the White Guards and the counter-revolutionaries for Soviet power. Their friendly, heartfelt words found an immediate response in our hearts. Many of the men of our 7th Division had gone through the hardships of the Civil War and could well appreciate the reminiscences of the war. We found that what was to be our barracks was still occupied by the 4th Infantry Division, which had not had time to move to its quarters in Slutsk. We had to take temporary shelter in private houses on the city outskirts. Each room, mostly ill-fitted for habitation, accommodated 3-4 persons. What made matters worse was the heavy autumn rains, which turned the roads into a quagmire. We had to save the horses, build stables, repair barracks, service outhouses, and prepare the winter training facilities. I had to call a meeting of party members and later of the entire regiment to explain the situation. In those far-off and trying years, men were capable of any sacrifice, ready for any hardship for the sake of a happy future for the Soviet people. Of course, we had a few bellyachers, but they were quickly brought to their senses. A sound army collective is a great force indeed. It builds an atmosphere of true friendship, an earnest of the unit's enthusiasm and combat efficiency. In late November, when snow fell, we managed to move to barracks and put the horses in stables. We still had much work to do to provide all the required facilities, of course, but we were through with the hardest part of the job. Our next task was to properly organize combat and political training in the new environment. Today it looks quite simple, but at that time, commanding a cavalry regiment at only 26, I had so little experience. In the old Tsarist army, I had finished a course for NCOs. Later, in the Red Army, I had gone through a 9-month course for cavalry commanders, and that was all. True, after the Civil War, I pored over manuals, regulations, and all sorts of books on military art, particularly on tactics. My theoretical knowledge lagged behind my practical experience, gained during World War I. I was well versed in combat training methods and had a liking for them. But I also knew that in theory I was still behind in what a regimental commander should know. So, upon giving it some thought, I concluded that there was no time to waste and that I had to study hard. But my routine work in the regiment kept me busy 12 hours a day. The only way out was to add another 4 hours for self-education. I would make up for the lost sleep later, after I had accumulated some knowledge. Most of the commanding officers who had risen from the ranks during the Civil War, as well as former warrant officers, held the same view. Though the core of the army had grown much stronger by that time, the fluidity of the personnel continued, supplies were far from adequate, and the mobilization readiness of the troops was insufficient. There were major faults in the work of the War Department, then headed by Trotsky. In January 1924, a plenary meeting of the Russian Communist Party's Central Committee decided to check the activity of the War Department, and a military commission of the Central Committee was set up, headed by V.V. Kuibyshev and later by S.I. Gusev. Material on the situation in the army was prepared for the plenary meeting by M.V. Frunze, K.J. Voroshilov, A.S. Bubnov, G.K. Orjonikidze, A.A. Andreev, I.S. Unschleicht, N.M. Schwernik, and others. The general conclusions drawn from the analysis of the collected facts were discouraging and strongly worded. It became clear that a radical military reform was needed to strengthen the country's armed forces. The Commission's proposals, approved by the party's Central Committee, formed the basis for such a reform. One of the key measures was to introduce the territorial principle of staffing the Red Army, combining it with the cadre principle. The territorial principle applied to infantry and cavalry divisions. Its purpose was to provide necessary military training for the maximum number of working people with the minimum distraction from production. 16 to 20% of the personnel of these divisions were cadre commanders, political workers and soldiers, while the rest were called up over 5 years for 3 months training in the first year and then for 1 month each year. The rest of the time the men were employed in industry and agriculture. This system allowed for quick deployment in case of need for sufficiently trained combat personnel to back up the cadre. The cost of training one soldier in a territorial unit over 5 years was much lower than in a cadre unit over 2 years. Of course, it would have been better to have a purely cadre army, but this was not feasible at that time. Some aspects of the military reform were entrenched in the law on military service passed in September 1925 by the USSR Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars. This was the first all-union law on compulsory military service for all citizens of our country, which also defined the organizational structure of the armed forces. The central and local military administrative bodies were reorganized. The new General Staff of the Red Army, led by M.V. Frunze, with deputies M.N. Tukhachevsky and B.M. Shaposhnikov, became the main organizing center of the Red Army. Control was simplified, and efficiency and responsibility were enhanced. The party strengthened from above the new organizational system of the armed forces. In January 1925, Mikhail Vassilievich Frunze, an outstanding communist and military leader, was appointed People's Commissar for the Army and Navy and chairman of the USSR Revolutionary Military Council. Once our regiment was visited by V.K. Blucher, the legendary Civil War hero. Before the revolution, he had been a worker at the Mytishchi car-building plant and then served as an NCO in the Tsar's army. Blucher had been a member of the Bolshevik Party since 1916. I had heard much about him, but that was our first meeting. It was a great event for all commanders and men of the regiment. He was invited by Division Commander G.D. Guy to see how military training and education were conducted in our regiment, a great honor for us. First, Blucher went to the kitchen to see how the personnel were fed and was satisfied with what he saw. He warmly shook hands with the cooks upon parting. One should have seen their faces. He then went through all the barracks and the club. In conclusion, he asked, "Well, what about combat readiness? You are stationed close to the border, you know." I answered that the regiment was well aware of its mission and was always ready to do its duty. "That is all very well. Now, order the alarm signal." Frankly, I had not expected this. Still, I recovered immediately and ordered the officer on duty to alert the regiment. An hour later, the regiment was lined up and ready for action. Blucher checked the packloads, arms and weapons, equipment and combat readiness in general. He was particularly exacting when inspecting the machine gun squadron and severely reprimanded one crew that had failed to pour water into the cooler of its machine gun and had no supply of it at all. "Do you know the price of such negligence in wartime?" Blucher asked. The soldiers could find nothing to say. "Let this be a lesson to you, comrades." Then Blucher proposed a simulated tactical situation. The enemy is approaching a very important tactical objective in an attempt to seize it. The enemy is 12 kilometers from the objective. The regiment and the enemy are about 25 kilometers apart. That is, the objective is midway between them. To waste time on briefing the commanders was counterproductive. The enemy would then reach the objective before us. I made the following decision. The 1st Squadron, with 4 heavy machine guns and 1 artillery piece, acting as the vanguard detachment, was ordered to follow me at a fast trot. The mission would be assigned on the move. The main force, under my deputy, was to follow 3 kilometers behind the vanguard, ready for a meeting engagement. The vanguard detachment, continually changing its pace, sometimes moving at a gallop, reached the objective just in time to secure a tactically favourable line and meet the enemy with fire. After the retreat call, Blucher addressed the regiment. "Thank you, comrades, for your honest service. What your regiment showed me today is all deserving of praise. I call on you to treasure and augment the fighting traditions of the glorious Samara Cavalry Division, which heroically fought the White Guards and the interventionists. Always be ready to fulfill the combat orders of our great motherland." The men responded with a loud "Hurrah!" Blucher's words had obviously moved everybody. I was charmed by his sincerity. A fearless fighter against the enemies of the young Soviet Republic, a popular hero, Blucher was an ideal to many. I admit that I, too, had always wanted to resemble that unflinching Bolshevik, steadfast comrade, and gifted commander. Division Commander Guy summoned me in late July 1924 and asked what I was doing to increase my knowledge. I said I was doing a lot of reading and was analysing World War operations. I thoroughly prepared for the classes I conducted with the commanding personnel of the regiment. "This is all well and good," Guy said, "but it is not enough today. Military science does not stand still. Our commanders are in need of a more systematic study of military problems. In autumn, I think, you should go to the higher cavalry school in Leningrad. That will serve you in good stead in the future." I thanked him and said I would do everything to live up to expectations. Back in the regiment, I immediately set to work, pored over textbooks, manuals and regulations, preparing for the entrance examinations. The exams were easy, a mere formality, and I entered the first group, together with K.K. Rokossovsky, M.I. Savelyev, E.K. Bagramyan, A.I. Yeremenko, and many other regimental commanders. I was in Leningrad for the first time, as were most of the other trainees. We took great interest in seeing the sights of the city and visited the scenes of the fighting in October 1917. Little did I know then that 17 years later I would be commander of the Leningrad front defending the city of Lenin against Nazi armies. The higher cavalry school was under V.M. Primakov, legendary commander of the celebrated 8th Cavalry Division of Red Cossacks, which had struck terror into the hearts of the White Guards during the Civil War. Primakov, a sturdy man of average height with fine hair, clever eyes and a pleasant face, at once won our favour. He was well educated and expressed himself in a precise and clear manner. Some time later, Primakov was transferred to the post of a Cossack Corps commander in Ukraine. Batorsky, a well-known cavalry theoretician, was appointed in his stead. We all were glad Primakov had been promoted and believed he would make an outstanding military leader. Soon the higher cavalry school was converted into the advanced training course for cavalry commanders, and the training was cut from 2 years to 1. The curriculum was packed. Besides classes, we had to do much studying at home. Today, as I look back, I sometimes wonder at our endurance and our fanatical persistence in mastering military knowledge. Once I was told to read a paper before the Military Scientific Society on the main factors influencing the theory of military art. Today this topic would hold no difficulty, but at that time I had no idea of how to approach it, how to start, and where to finish. The advice my party comrades gave me helped me out. The paper was even published in a bulletin put out for the trainees. I still remember the friendly relationship and cooperation in socio-political work between our party organisation and that of Leningrad. Veteran workers from the factories who had seen Lenin and who had stormed the Winter Palace were frequent guests. They told us about the great October days. We also visited plants and told the workers about our Civil War experiences. Many of us were former workers. Naturally, we understood each other perfectly and were good friends. We often had equestrian contests, and Leningraders would come in large numbers to watch them. Vaulting, concours hippique, handling sabres and lances, and races and steeplechases in summer were particularly popular. K.K. Rokossovsky, M.I. Savelyev, I.K. Bagramian, and I were unfailingly among the contestants. In autumn and winter, we concentrated on theoretical studies and political education. We did much work in class with sand tables and maps. We worked a lot with the horses, riding to improve our horsemanship, which commanders of those days had to be good at. Fencing was optional, but we gave it much of our spare time. In the summer of 1925, we were mostly engaged in tactical combat training in the field under the immediate command of Batorsky, the chief of the course. He passed on much knowledge and experience to us. To complete the course, we were to make a forced march to the Volkhov River. There we exercised in swimming the river with a horse in conditions of a forced crossing. It is a pretty tough job to swim a river with a horse. It was not enough to be able to swim in uniform. One had also to control a swimming horse. Much attention was given to this exercise. I recall a funny incident on the Volkhov River. After the exercises were over, Misha Savelyev from our section, who wanted to demonstrate his skill, said he would cross the Volkhov standing on the saddle to keep his uniform dry. The commander agreed, but ordered a couple of boats to be kept ready just in case. Misha slung the stirrups across the saddle and boldly rode the horse into the river. It walked out to the deep water and swam. Misha stood firmly on the saddle, holding the reins. All went well at first. Then, in the middle of the river, the horse apparently got tired and began to thrash about. Try as he might, Misha lost his balance and tumbled into the water. The boats came in useful. The horse reached the bank, and Savelyev, soaked through, was brought ashore in a boat soon afterward. We laughed and joked, but not Savelyev. He had failed and had also lost his boots in the river. They had been slung around his neck. He rode back to barracks in his socks. Having finished the courses, Savelyev, commander of the 42nd Cavalry Regiment, Rybalkin, commander of a squadron of the 37th Astrakhan Regiment, and I decided to return to our station in Minsk on horseback and not by train. It meant covering 963 kilometers of country roads. We were to go through Vitebsk, Orsha, and Borisov. We submitted our plan to the command of the courses and were granted permission. Unfortunately, no checkpoints, servicing, and food supplies could be provided en route. Yet we did not give up the idea, though fully aware of the difficulties ahead, especially since a cold and rainy autumn was setting in. We decided to cover the 963 kilometers in 7 days. There had never been a cross-country run on horseback of this kind before, either in the Soviet Union or abroad. If our luck did not run out, we expected to set a world record in a group run on horseback. Our chief aim was to see if we had received enough training to make a long-distance run within a limited time. Early one morning in the autumn of 1925, our friends and some of the course chiefs came to the Moscow gate on the outskirts of Leningrad to bid us farewell. We decided to continually change pace, trotting and walking and sometimes going at a gallop. The first day we rode 10 kilometers less than planned because we saw that the horses grew tired, and what was worse, my horse went lame. Dera was a thoroughbred 12 years old, which is a considerable age for a horse. We too were tired and badly wanted to rest. The villagers welcomed us heartily, fed the horses, and treated us to a square meal. The next morning my mare was still lame. I stopped up the hole in her hoof with wax, bandaged the hoof, and decided to lead the horse for a while. Fortunately, soon she stopped limping. I mounted. No, she did not limp. I broke into a trot. All went well. To take the weight off the horse's injured right leg, I decided to continue the run, either walking or galloping with the left leg forward. My comrades had an easier time riding sound horses, since I had to dismount frequently, lead the horse by the bridle, and was naturally under a greater physical strain. But during halts, my friends made it their task to find feed and tend the horses. On the 7th day, When we had passed Borisov and were approaching Minsk, we saw a mass of people with red flags and streamers. It was some of the lads from our regiment and townspeople who had come to meet us. We put spurs to our horses, galloped up to the speaker's stand, and reported to the garrison commander and the chairman of the city soviet on the successful completion of the run. The spectators cheered. 2 days later, we had a test 2-kilometre obstacle race, inspection and weighing. The results were good, and our run was given high marks. In 7 days, the horses had lost 8 to 12 kilograms, and the riders 5 to 6 kilograms. We received government prizes and a commendation from the command, and were granted short leaves. I went to my village to see my mother and sister. I found that during my absence, my mother had aged greatly but still worked very hard. My sister had 2 children and also looked old. The harsh post-war years and the famine of 1921 to 22 had evidently gone hard with them. My little nephews and I soon became friends. They loved to rummage about in my suitcase, extracting from it whatever they liked. The village was impoverished, the peasants were poorly dressed, and the cattle population had fallen sharply. Many families, indeed, had lost all their livestock during the crop failure of 1921. But to my surprise, practically no one complained. The people understood the reasons for the post-war hardships. The kulaks and shopkeepers kept to themselves. Probably they still hoped that the good old days would return, especially after the new economic policy was introduced. Taverns and private shops reopened in Ugodsky Zavod, the district centre, and the budding consumer cooperatives tried to compete with them. On my return to the division, I learned that new tables of organisation were being introduced under which it would consist of 4 cavalry regiments instead of 6. The 39th Buzuluk Cavalry Regiment, which I commanded, was merged with the 40th Regiment, while the 41st and 42nd Regiments formed a new regiment, the 39th Meliky Pugachevsky Cavalry Regiment. For me and for Saveliev, commander of the 42nd Regiment, this was a matter of personal concern, because one of us was to take command of the new 39th Regiment, while the other would be transferred to another formation. Understandably, each of us wanted to stay with the division, which had become home to us. The division command chose me, and Saveliev was given another appointment. I showed understanding for his disappointment. Our parting was cordial, and we met later as good friends. Formerly, the regiments had consisted of 4 squadrons. The new ones, in accordance with the military reform, had 6 squadrons, each 2 forming a cavalry battalion. In addition, the regiment had a 16-piece machine gun squadron, a regimental battery, a signals platoon, an engineers platoon, and a chemical platoon, and a regimental school for non-commissioned officers. This was carried into effect in 2 ways. If the commander was a communist, he usually assumed the commissar's duties as well, and was thus responsible for combat training, administrative and quartermaster activities, and the entire party political work. The commander had a deputy for political matters. This important step, which tightened discipline and enhanced combat readiness in the army, had become practicable at that time because the commanding personnel had changed much for the better. If the commander was not a party member, he was responsible only for combat training and administrative and quartermaster work, while party political work was in the hands of a commissar who shared responsibility with the commander for the unit's morale and combat readiness. One of the orders of the Revolutionary Military Council of that period said, "Always keeping in mind that the task of Soviet power in military building is the establishment of one-man command, the commissar must, on the one hand, draw the commander with whom he associates into the sphere of communist ideas, and on the other hand, he himself must carefully study military art so as to be able in time to become a commander or take an administrative post." In the spring of 1925, we received a written directive from the Party Central Committee to all party organizations entitled On One-Man Command in the Red Army, which pointed out that all the preceding work of the party and the military bodies to strengthen the Red Army as a whole, and its commanding cadres in particular, had created favorable conditions for implementing the one-man command principle. Some comrades, though a minority, thought at that time that one-man command would cut back the party's influence in the army. but it was a communist who was made the sole commander of a unit. Therefore the party's role, far from diminishing, grew stronger. The commander was vested with greater responsibility to the party for all aspects of army life. Discipline was considerably tightened, and the combat readiness of our armed forces was substantially enhanced. Indeed, the relationship between the commander and the commissar or political worker tended to grow more solid and close. Later on, in 1928, the Revolutionary Military Council, acting on directions of the Party Central Committee, issued the rules on commissars, commanders and assistants on political matters, which made the commissar responsible for the party political work and the morale of a unit, formation, while relieving him of all control functions. After attending the commander's course, my work seemed easier to me. I felt more sure of myself and more independent in matters of combat training and political education and in controlling the regiment. Things were going along smoothly in the regiment. In the winter of 1926, I was summoned by A.P. Krokmal, Commissar of the 3rd Cavalry Corps, and S.K. Timoshenko, who had assumed command of the corps in February. As I entered the study, I also saw Division Commander K.D. Stepnoy Spizarny, Division Commissar G.M. Stern, and Chief of the Political Department L.I. Bocharov. "We have called you in to propose that in addition to being regimental commander, you also assume the duties of regimental commissar and become sole chief of the regiment," said Timoshenko. "The division command and the political department believe you are ready for this. What would you say?" I was silent a little longer than expected, and then replied that I thought I could manage if assisted by the division command and the political department. A few days later, I was appointed the regiment's sole commander. This being the first such experiment in the 7th Cavalry Division, it imposed a special responsibility on me. In organizational and ideological matters, I was aided by the party bureau secretary and my assistant on political questions. They did not hesitate, if necessary, to correct me in a true party spirit. Inexperienced as I was, I naturally made some mistakes, and my colleagues' suggestions were useful. To engage in the political education of the personnel, the superiors must know much more than their subordinates. In those years, we troop commanders knew more and learned quicker when it came to combat training than when it came to the basics of Marxism-Leninism. One reason was that each of us was overburdened with administrative work, combat training, and military self-education. On the other hand, many of us underestimated the importance of a thorough knowledge of Marxist-Leninist theory and of the party's organizational work in the army. Political workers were certainly much better qualified than combat commanders. Soon the division commander was replaced by D.A. Schmidt, transferred from the Ukraine. The new commander was very much unlike his predecessor in character, experience, and style of work. Stepnoy Spizarny had been fussy and loquacious. Schmidt was highly intelligent, not given to empty talk, but unfortunately did not take pains in his work. In the summer of 1926, the division moved to camp in a picturesque area near Zdanovichi, some 20 kilometers from Minsk. Intense combat training went on in camp, with special emphasis on the tactical field instruction of the units, commanders, headquarters, and the formation as a whole. I must confess that I preferred tactics to all other subjects and studied it with pleasure. The army is an instrument of war. Its sole purpose is to fight the country's enemies, and tactical preparedness is an essential element of success in this struggle. An army lacking in tactical training is forced to learn in the course of fighting at the cost of unnecessary losses. To develop the regiment's tactical skills, demonstration lessons and instruction classes were regularly held. Here the personnel mastered the technique of reconnaissance, organization of combat, and employment of the technical means of warfare. Maneuvers mark the culmination point of all tactical training. Beginning in 1925, the Byelorussian military district held exercises each year after the summer camp period. The 7th Cavalry Division invariably took part in all these maneuvers, and I cannot remember a single case when it failed to get good marks for tactical training. To a great extent, this was the result of our commander's attitude toward tactical lessons. All regimental commanders of the 7th Division, I may add, knew their tactics fairly well and were eager to improve their knowledge. At that time, the commander of the 37th Cavalry Regiment was V.T. Volsky, the man who in November 1942 commanded a mechanized corps on the Stalingrad front. Together with the 51st Army, his corps struck in the general direction of Kalach, where it joined up with elements of the southwestern front. The 38th Cavalry Regiment was under V.A. Gaidukov, who commanded a corps and other formations during the past war. There were also experienced commanders in other units of the division. Much attention was given to sports and physical training. We veteran soldiers knew better than anybody else that it took tough men to bear the burdens of war. The success of a unit depends on the training of each soldier. In war, troops frequently have to make forced marches in any weather, day and night, along roads and cross-country, to deploy for a swift attack on the move, and to pursue the enemy till his final destruction. In the event of an unfavourable outcome, it is important quickly to withdraw from battle and regroup. Unless a unit is in fine physical shape, it soon loses breath, is usually behind time, incurs heavy losses, and may pay a high price for its unpreparedness. In all equestrian events, our 39th Regiment was the principal contender among the best cavalry units of the Byelorussian military district. We had knocked together an active group of sportsmen, many of them commanders. I also practiced horsemanship regularly. We were not as good at marksmanship, and the sharpshooter teams of the 40th Regiment invariably beat us. In horsemanship, however, we always outpointed the 40th Regiment, and for that matter the other formations of our corps. This, it seems, was very annoying for our rivals, and they did all they could to outride us at any cost, even by trickery. In one district equestrian competition, a commander from the 6th Division, intent on demonstrating his skill and the exceptional endurance of his horse, hid another horse of similar colouring in the woods halfway from the start. The trickster rode the first half of the run at top speed, handed over the badly winded steed to his orderly, mounted the hidden horse, and finished the race first. He received the first prize amidst the applause of his mates. But his triumph was short-lived, for the trick was soon discovered, and the culprit got his due. But this did not stop our opponents from the 6th Cavalry Division. They would try to box up the obvious favourite during a race, fix green twigs for their men, and dry ones for us during willow-cutting exercises, and so on. I recall Semyon Boudeni's visit to our regiment. I had not met him before, but I knew of his exploits fighting for our country against the White Guards and interventionists, and was eager to get acquainted with him, the legendary commander of the 1st Mounted Army. One morning in the spring of 1927, there was a telephone call from Division Commander Schmidt. "Boudeni will probably visit your regiment," he said, "so get ready to meet him." "At what time, and how shall we meet him?" "I don't know exactly when. He will. First go to the 37th Regiment, then to the 38th, and then to yours. How to meet him? That's up to you. You're the commander." The division commander obviously did not have in mind any special ceremony, and wanted Boudeni to be met in the usual manner prescribed by the regulations. In the afternoon there was a call from Gaidukov, commander of the 38th Regiment. "Get ready for the guests. They're on their way," he said. There was no time to lose. I gathered my closest assistants, Frolkov, my deputy for political affairs, Shelakovsky, secretary of the Regimental Party Bureau, and Malyashev, regimental quartermaster. He went out to the entrance. Within 5 minutes, 2 cars drove through the gates. From the first alighted Boudeni and Timoshenko. As prescribed by the regulations, I reported and introduced my assistants. Boudeni greeted us all. "What are your orders?" I asked Boudeni. "And what do you suggest?" asked he. "I would like to show you how our commanders and men live and work." "Good, but first I want to see how you feed your men." In the mess room and the kitchen, Boudeni inquired in detail into the quality of the victuals, their processing and cooking. Then he wrote a commendation to the cooks and the mess officer in the mess record book. After that, he checked the state of combat training and said, "Now let us see the horses." I gave the signal to lead out the horses. In 10 minutes the squadrons were lined up and the show of horses began. The horses were in good condition and excellently shod. Budeni thanked the men for the fine upkeep of the horses and left for the 6th Chongar Division. Our regiment also received A.I. Yegorov, commander of the Byelorussian military district. I knew from comrades who had worked with him that Yegorov came from a peasant family and had been a blacksmith striker. He was a self-taught man, and when called up to the Tsarist army, he had entered an officers' school and was commissioned. He rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the old army. In July 1918, Yegorov joined the Bolshevik Party and remained a faithful and staunch communist to the end of his life. During the Civil War, Yegorov showed his great talent as a military leader. He was in command of the Southern Front until Denikin's White Guard armies were routed and was then placed at the head of the Southwestern Front, fighting the White Poles. After the Civil War, Alexei Yegorov, a distinguished military leader decorated with 4 Orders of the Red Banner and awarded presentation weapons, commanded several military districts and, in 1931, was appointed Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. In 1935, he was made Marshal of the Soviet Union. Yegorov came to our regiment unexpectedly. It was in 1927, after a Central Committee plenary meeting of the Communist Party of Byelorussia, which he had attended. When his arrival was reported to me, we were doing tactical exercises. The subject was concealed outflanking of the enemy and cutting into his rear for a swift attack. Yegorov wished to attend. Everything was going quite smoothly. The unit commanders made bold and rational decisions. Yegorov was in a good mood. He joked a great deal, and everybody felt at ease. After my summing up, Yegorov made a few comments and suggestions. I particularly remember his remark that it was not enough to teach tactics to our commanders, and that they should also be instructed in the operational art. He emphasized that if a war were unleashed by our country's enemies, many of our commanders would need operational knowledge. After the classes, Yegorov asked, "In what state is the regiment's mobilization plan?" "We have been working on it, and we have some questions to which our superiors have so far given no answer," I replied. "Well, let's see the mobilization plan and your questions," Yegorov said. For about an hour, the Chief of Staff and I reported in detail on the regiment's mobilization schedule and answered Yegorov's questions. Not bad at all," he said. "Now what is not clear to you?" Our position was complicated by the proximity of the state border. In an emergency, we would have to take the field much below strength. Besides, the regiment would have to detail personnel for the formation of second echelons. "Fighting our first engagement with the enemy when we're under strength may affect the personnel's morale," I said. "You are right," Yegorov said, "but we have no alternative, and we simply must have second echelons. The enemy must not be underestimated. We must prepare for war seriously and be ready to fight a clever, skillful, and strong enemy. If he proves not as strong and as clever as we thought, this will only be to our advantage." Yegorov was interested in many things: the state of emergency rations, the condition of the soldiers' barracks, and commanders' quarters. We reported that most commanding personnel were quartered in private homes, with, as a rule, one family to a room. At that time, we were donating personal valuables to the country's gold fund to finance the building of new factories and plants. Yegorov was interested in that also. "And what has the regiment commander donated?" he inquired. 4 silver cigarette cases won in equestrian contests, and my wife's gold ring and earrings, I replied. In fact, everyone was doing the same at that time. The district commander looked us over and said, "Very good, comrades. This is as it should be." If I remember rightly, a delegation of British industrial workers visited the division in 1927. It wanted to express its appreciation to us in some way and gave us a red banner. From that day on, the 7th Cavalry Division was known as the English Proletariat Division. Things livened up noticeably in our division when Schmidt was replaced by Danilo Serdish, a Serbian and a celebrated commander of the 1st Mounted Army. Serdish at once threw himself heart and soul into the work and quickly won the esteem of the unit commanders. I appreciated him for the demanding approach he invariably took and his constant concern for improving the combat and political training of the troops. Serdish went into all the details of party activity and was a model military and political leader. Privately, he was a most modest man. With Danilo Serdish in command, all field exercises and military district maneuvers were most instructive and invariably brought renown to the 7th Samara Cavalry Division. We all felt that our operational and tactical knowledge was improving largely due to the efforts of our divisional commander. In short, Serdish was a worthy commander and able instructor. In January 1930, K.K. Rokossovsky was appointed commander of the 7th Samara Cavalry Division. A little later, in May 1930, I was appointed commander of the 2nd Cavalry Brigade of the 7th Division. I have already said that Rokossovsky and I had attended the commander's course in Leningrad in 1924–25 and knew each other well. He treated me with great tact, while I highly valued his military knowledge and extensive experience in military training and education. I welcomed his appointment and was sure that Rokossovsky would be a fine commander of our veteran division, and I was not mistaken. I was in command of the 39th Cavalry Regiment for almost 7 years. It had been a good school for me. Besides practical experience, I had received thorough theoretical and tactical training during district maneuvers, corps and division exercises and war games. As a one-man commander, I learned the full value of party guidance in running Red Army units and organizing their daily activity. Of course, all this had not been easy to grasp as one went along, and mistakes had been made. But one makes mistakes in any activity unless one does exactly as one is told by one's superiors and shows no initiative. In my view, the main thing is not the mistakes as such, but how quickly they are seen and rectified. I was said to have been unnecessarily exacting.